Thank you so much, Emily. Hey, hey, hey. I'm Kimberly Dark, and it's the Hope Desk. And I'm a writer and sociologist and storyteller. I have simple answers for you about some questions on social inequity. And we handle two per month here. And of course, I don't have all the answers. I don't have the only right answers, but I'll spend this time doing what I can to address these things because I think it is hopeful when people feel informed enough about topics to enter public conversations about them, because that's what we need to be doing if we want to fix social inequalities. So I'm not offering you in-depth scholarship on these topics. In most cases, somebody else is more qualified to do that than I am. But I'm going to offer you a few resources each time we're together. So feel free to use the chat box to ask questions or make comments as we go along. And then I'll also stop and address some of those when we get to the end. I will also, just so you know it's coming, I will also ask you where you might be able to discuss these topics later in your own life, because that's kind of the point here. So our two topics to handle today are cultural appropriation and teacher salaries. And I'm going to start with teacher salaries. Okay, so this is a question that came up. By the way, you can raise these questions. You can message me on Facebook or by email through the website and raise issues that you would like me to handle at the Hope Desk. So here's the question about teacher salaries is, wow, people are always talking about how teachers are underpaid, but it seems like a really solid middle class wage. Like a lot of people who are teachers end up owning homes and having retirement and, all kinds of stuff that other people don't have. So what's up with that? As usual, I'm going to go way back and start with the fact that, first of all, not everyone is entitled to an equal education in the United States. Do you know this? A lot of people don't already know this, that education is differently funded in different parts of the country, in different districts even. Teachers might be paid differently at different schools. There might be different funding available for facilities, for additional programming, for testing. All of these things vary. And it's kind of a big deal to understand this in this discussion because, wow, we tend to think in the US of education as the great equalizer, that if you work hard, you can get ahead, you can, go to college, you can do well if you do well academically when you're in K-12. But this isn't true because not everyone has the same opportunities K-12. Some schools literally do not provide the kind of courses that might make one competitive to apply to college. Some schools have super, super high suspension and expulsion rates, usually for children of color. A lot of the schools that have lower funding as a result of property taxes in that area being low. And often that affects Black and brown folks more than it does white folks. Of course, it's possible to be poor and white and go to an underfunded school. It's just a heck of a lot likely if you're a person of color that you're going to end up going to an underfunded school. So, what does all this have to do with the history of teaching? This has been true since day one. So let's be clear that when teacher first started as a job hired by the state, it was basically a job that was given to women. And there were some very clear requirements, right? First of all, the requirement not to be married and have your own family, because that would distract you from the work that you need to do with the children in your care. A lot of times teachers even lived at the schools that they worked at. And also, there were rules about, how you could socialize, and the appearance of chastity was very important. I mean, these kinds of things that we don't think about today are actually foundational to some of the problems that we deal with today. So there are lots and lots of professions that when they start out female dominated, they don't gain in, money and prestige in the same way as other professions. And then when they gender integrate, sometimes those issues are dealt with, but not always. So we have a situation now where the majority of teachers are still white women, K 12. There are definitely more men in high school education and definitely more men in administration. What do you know? There's been really interesting studies done actually about how men who go into K-6 education in order to be teachers have a hard time staying in the classroom because every part of the system wants to promote them. Surely they're only in the classroom for a few years until they can become the principal. So, men who really, really, no, I want to teach first grade, that's what I want to do, have often a hard time staying there because people want to promote them. So, so be clear that this gender business is still happening today, and it influences the way we understand how much teachers should be paid. So a history of feminized wages is an important thing to know. And the remaining disrespect for the profession when that's where we're coming from is important to understand also. Okay, so here's another thing that people love to do is they love to look at state or national averages in order to talk about teacher wages. You can't do that because school districts are local governance entities and it varies a tremendous amount, even within the same city, what one district or one school pays versus what another one does. So looking at averages is not helpful. When you look at like the kind of places where there have been massive strikes recently and like the state of Oklahoma, for instance, miserable teacher wages and folks went on strike. You can't compare the state of Oklahoma with the state of California, for instance, with regard to do teachers make a fair salary? This kind of question. You can't even compare California to California, right? Because of those multiple districts. So districts set policies, important to understand. Hey, there is something else influencing this question about teacher pay, and that has to do with the fact that how do you suppose teacher pay got to the level it is today? It was the unions. I'm just going to tell you. And teachers' unions are still powerful entities in a nation that has mostly, um, you know, I'm looking for the right word to say what we have done with unions. I mean, I want to just tell you, if you love, weekends and an 8-hour workday, thank the union. At no point in history has power ever conceded, um, to pay people more or give people adequate time off or provide safe working conditions without union representation, without collective bargaining ability. So the sad truth is that the United States, among first world nations, is not very great at, um, you know, having a lot of unions. Uh, if you want to know more about that, start looking in the Reagan era. That was when we had a big decline in union membership across the country, and also declining middle class. So teachers unions are still important, and this is one of the reasons that sometimes folks look at teacher pay and they go, hey, they're actually getting a good deal because they have health benefits, they get a pension, they get, time off. Well, these are actually first world standards that everyone should be able to expect, but we cannot when more and more jobs and industries lose union benefits. So one of the reasons that teacher pay looks like it is a good deal sometimes is because um, other industries are losing those middle class conditions. So sometimes people with master's degrees are, earning very little money. And that's true for teachers as well, but sometimes it is more true for other professions, sometimes social workers, sometimes college professors, right? The majority of college professors are lecturers or adjuncts. The California State University system where I teach is one of the few that has, like, we are unionized as part-time lecturers. That is significant to the kind of pay and benefits that we receive. So you cannot compare apples and oranges with regard to teacher benefits. And I'm going to ask Emily to share. I know, I don't know who I'm talking to share two articles with you that you can have a look at with regard to the dire situation that some teachers find themselves in, trying to not just live on a low salary themselves, but partially make up for the fact that the school has a suppressed budget, that the school has inadequate funding for things like supplies and books. And so, some teachers are in this kind of terrible position. I want to be clear, though, that there are definitely still districts where a teacher can earn a solid middle class wage and have access not just to benefits, but also access to, again, through unions, access to information about investing, information about buying a home, right? Sometimes it's not just about the benefits themselves, but about the network of information that you can be exposed to in order to end up as a person, later in life, who is a homeowner with a pension and, all of these things that we look at as being, good, solid middle class earnings. So the problem here is not so much some teachers make a good middle class wage. The problem is that so many people don't. So if we think about like median income for a family of four in the United States, that means 50% of households earn less than about $58,000. This is a real problem, right? If you are saying, well, somebody's got to be earning six figures in order to do well, that's kind of true. But we have taken the middle class and really scooted it down to poverty level wages and debt as an expectation. Oh, this sounds so terrible. It sounds so awful. And it is. I'm going to just pause right here, and you can read up some more on the articles I've offered you. One of them is a Time Magazine kind of photo documentary that is showing you some dire circumstances. The other is really parsing some of these issues more closely. So I'm going to stop there with regard to teachers' salaries. And maybe you have questions about that right now, or maybe I'm going to go on to the next topic. All right. Feel free to write stuff in the chat box when it occurs to you, and we'll get back to the rest of it later as well. Hey, let's talk about cultural appropriation. Wow, there would be so many ways to talk about this, and I'm just choosing a few ways to talk about this. I want to just bring up the question as it emerged regarding cultural appropriation. So here's the example. Is about a Black woman who became interested in Irish dancing and was totally into it and totally getting better at it, and then eventually was invited to join a company, Irish dance company. And the question was, well, wait a minute, is that cultural appropriation? And I am going to address this issue, understanding that there are many ways to see a topic like this. So I want to maybe complicate the way we see this kind of question rather than give it one answer, right? Because there are loads of kinds of answers you can give, but understanding the issues involved are important. So let me just say this first of all. I don't think that we want to live in a world where there is no intercultural sharing. I don't want to live in that world. That world would suck. That world, I mean, think about it. What are we going to eat, for goodness sakes, if we can't have cultural sharing? I mean, we want to live in that world where people share their culture and are interested in other people's cultures. That's great. We also have to look critically at what sharing actually means. So, here are some questions to ask yourself when you are thinking about the idea of cultural sharing. First of all, are the original practitioners or purveyors of that culture in charge of the sharing, or has something been taken from them without their consent? Also, are those individuals respected, which also means sought out and compensated as the experts of their own lives and practices? Oh, think about that for a moment. Here, let me just give you an example to, hang your hat on with that one. If you think about yoga practice in the United States, where are all of the Indian people teaching yoga, right? Are they actually respected, sought out, well compensated as experts on their own lives and practices? That's not to say that yoga shouldn't be shared and practiced widely. I happen to be a proponent of sharing and practicing yoga widely, of making sure that everyone has access to yoga practice because I love it my own self and I think that it's worthwhile. But we have to ask these questions when it comes to, is it cultural appropriation? All right, here's another question. Has the practice being shared been twisted or changed or made more palatable for its new audience? Huh? You might think about yoga again in that situation. You might also think about the Irish dancing in the original example. Chances are, if an Irish dancing company is bringing someone in, they are still the experts and in charge and not twisting or changing their what they are offering just because of that new person that has joined them. I don't know if they're changing their practices for audience. That would be another question. No? Here's another question to ask oneself. Is there a broader social structure that oppresses the group being borrowed from? Oh, check it out. We might also think about colonization in this case of an entire group of people. So, back to the yoga example, there is a history of colonization by Britain, right, of India that significantly influenced the way yoga was shared throughout the world. I still can see, though, in the history of yoga that there is a willing sharing of that practice throughout the world, but how it happened is definitely influenced by colonization. Here's another example in this situation. Let's think about Black entertainers in the United States. You can definitely say that there is a respect of Black entertainers, that there is that they're sought out and compensated, and often experts on the history and culture that they are presenting. But is there a broader social structure that oppresses that group being borrowed from? Absolutely. So sometimes there is appropriation where, white artists will take on Black ways of dressing or talking or interacting in order to capitalize on those without that respect and compensation going back where it belongs. We also have a long history in the US, of course, of Black entertainers being lauded but not considered fully human, not allowed to stay in the hotels where in the towns where they were performing, not even being able to come in the front door of some of those venues during the Jim Crow era. Folks, that's not that long ago, right? You have to handle this as a full reality of what we are discussing. So, back to the Black Irish dancer. I'm going to say, no, that is not cultural appropriation. That's what I'm going to say based on what I know so far in this situation. Um, Even the person who asked this question, was wondering, wait, is it possible for it to be cultural appropriation? Like, was there a time when Black people, oppressed or colonized Irish people? This is an appropriate question to ask. Of course it is. And this is exactly the line of reasoning that we have to work through when we are wondering, is this cultural appropriation? So this comes down to another question, which is someone who made that comment, hey, that's cultural appropriation. Someone was offended. What do we do with that? So again, I think we need to ask some questions. The first of which is the person stating offense affected by the situation, or are they a bystander critiquing the situation? Are you following me here? See, this is an issue nowadays, especially on the internet, when people can critique things all day long without really any basis for doing so. If that is a person who doesn't understand the difference between cultural sharing and cultural appropriation, they might just go, hey, appropriation, I've learned that somewhere, right? But if that person is Irish and actually has a rationale, like understands where their own feelings are coming from, I would be inclined to listen to that. I would be inclined to question. So this is significant when we come down to the issue of things like, oh, should white people have dreadlocks? Or, what about the tribal tattoo that you're going to get on your arm, because you visited Hawaii and you liked it. And so you want to have Polynesian kind of tattoos. These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Is it possible that we are offending someone because of social inequality? So this even comes down to a question like, I'll tell you one that I asked myself recently. Um, there is a clothing maker online that is making beautiful, in my opinion, dresses with African print fabrics. So here's the question. Should I buy that African print dress? Is that cultural sharing or is it cultural appropriation? So here's my answer. I don't know. I don't know. The thing that we have to handle is cultural sharing would be maybe easier to see if, for instance, I were visiting or doing some work in some country in Africa, and I came to learn something about those fabrics and those patterns and those dress styles, and that sharing was freely given, and the people around me in that setting, those are respected fabrics and styles to wear. This gets trickier if I'm just buying it off of Etsy in the United States, because I know that African prints, African styles of dressing are not as respected on Black women in the US. For instance, if I wear that dress to a job interview, I'm still going to be seen as, oh, interesting, right? But if a Black woman wears that dress to a job interview in the US, she might be seen poorly as a result. So this is tricky. And you know what? I'm okay with that. And I'm going to suggest that we all need to get okay with the idea that we got to think things through. We got to think things through and sometimes change our minds or sometimes choose which audiences that we do and say certain things with, because we want to be sensitive to other people. We want to disrupt the assumption that because I am white and I have an internet clicking finger, I can buy whatever I please and wear it and not be totally worried about it. So I'm going to offer you two resources with regard to this topic of cultural appropriation. One of them is an article that I wrote about tattoos as a threshold. And it is about more than cultural appropriation, but it is also about that. It is about how we make decisions about what we wear on our bodies. Now, if my comments about yoga, because this is, wow, a big complex issue. if my comments about yoga sparked more of your interest, I'm also offering you a website for my friend and colleague Susanna Barkataki, who has written a book called Embrace Yoga's Roots and teaches workshops on well, on cultural appropriation and yoga, right? On basically on, how not to be an asshole in your yoga practice or in your yoga teaching. And she is Desi, an Indian British woman, and a yoga teacher in the United States. And just pause for a moment and think that through. Chances are, if you are a yoga practitioner in the U.S., you haven't had very many Indian teachers, and we have to ask why that is. When this is a practice that many Indian people are raised with. Not that every Indian teacher person wants to teach yoga, but um, there might be just a few more if we were adequately handling this question of uh, colonialism and cultural appropriation. All right, so many things to say about cultural appropriation, but that's where I'm going to stop right now just to find out, what are your thoughts? Do you have questions or comments about these topics? And
Yeah,
you can,
Kimberly, this is Cynthia.
hey, Cynthia.
Hi. So I actually just had a conversation last weekend or so um, where I was saying, if somebody says they're offended by something, you should probably stop and respect that. And he said, yeah, but what if I said, I'm offended that you're wearing that shirt? What are you going to do? Just, or I'm offended that you're blah, 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 blah. And so I really like what you said. And maybe this is the difference between critique versus something else. And I forgot what you said. So I'll shut myself up while you answer.
Pointless snarky criticism. I don't know what I said. It wasn't that. But but right, does the person offering the sensitivity, does that person have a reason to be offering that sensitivity, right? So, because I think that call out call outs can do a world of good sometimes, right? But they also can be gratuitous. And especially with regard to social media and people learning just enough about something like cultural appropriation, like, there's a great article on everyday feminism about cultural appropriation. You can go read it and feel like you know everything. And sometimes that individual has not adequately thought through, wait a minute, cultural sharing is actually really important in our world, and we want that. We want to have an ability to learn about other cultures and share cultural practices. I mean, it is a rich and important thing. So that question about, is someone saying, okay, that's appropriation, or I'm uncomfortable with that, the question then becomes, okay, if I can see you're affected by this, then yes, I want to kindly pause and re-examine my need to have that hairstyle, wear those clothes, do that thing. But if somebody is just saying, I don't like that shirt on you, that's offending me. I don't think, for instance, somebody who is, doesn't believe that women should be able to show as much of their bodies in public as is the norm in the U.S. Maybe they have religious issues with that or something. If that individual says, "I'm offended by what you're wearing," my question would be, which of us is on top in the social hierarchy here? Which of us is having their civil liberties questioned or curtailed as a result of the power difference between us? Right? In that situation, I would be more likely to say, well, I'm sorry you're offended, and you don't get to cancel out somebody else's civil liberties, which is very different from, I see why you're offended, and I willingly volunteer to not offend you because wow, there is a history of inequality here. Um, It's tricky
I have a
because, people want to have their personal choices. Yes.
I actually have a question. I was wondering if you could give me advice on how to handle a situation that happened to me this week. I was walking with a friend and she was telling me about she's a ceramic artist and she makes totems, which is that's not the issue. She makes totems. And she said that she had just recently made a new topper for one of the totems that she made for one of her customers, and it was a kingfisher because, and I'm quoting, because the kingfisher is her client's spirit animal. So I I'm assuming that this person is not that the client is not an indigenous person.
Mhm,
That's a
mhm.
big assumption on my part. But I don't know. I felt like calling her in, whatever we're saying.
Yeah.
But also like I couldn't I couldn't deal. You
Fair
know?
enough. Fair enough. So let me just say, first of all, something about calling out versus calling in. Calling out is really when you just point out somebody's wrongdoing. And if you are a person being oppressed by someone else in that moment, a call out is appropriate because it is in the moment, it is direct, it is clear, it is, I am saying this is bothering me because of this. Calling in is way more appropriate, especially when we have, like in the situation you're describing, where the aggrieved party is not present, right? Um, Calling in is also where we generally are more careful to try and help someone understand what has gone wrong or what might be offensive or what the history of this situation is. It is a call to come into community rather than a call out, which, like I said, sometimes is appropriate, especially if a person is being immediately, directly wounded by a situation. So yeah, uh, spirit animal. Again, we got to go back and understand that indigenous people in North America are still in a dire situation of um, not stewarding their ancestral lands, of extreme poverty, of vulnerability to illness, of, like all of these things are current situations. And yet, much of indigenous culture has been homogenized and romanticized for the consumption of white Americans, and spirit animal is one of those terms that has now taken on, it has gotten completely unhinged from its previous associations even, and has come to mean an animal I greatly identify with, right? And so I think that most of the time when people say, "Oh, that's my spirit animal," that's actually what they mean. And so sometimes it can be appropriate to simply say, "Hey, until indigenous people actually get their land back, why don't we stop using the words that belong to those spiritual practices?" And maybe what you mean is that bird, I forgot what bird it is already, that bird is really her favorite thing ever.
Yeah.
And isn't that great then that you put it on this thing? See how quickly
Yeah.
I lose details. That bird is
Kingfisher.
on this thing.
You forgot my
Kingfisher.
name. You also forgot my
And I
name.
forgot
And
your
you know
name.
what?
I'm,
What are
this is how it is today.
it's month 12, Kimberly.
Month
Month
12?
12
Month
of this.
of the
So,
isolation.
loss of proper nouns, I think that happens around
I'm,
month 12.
I'm telling you, we got on this call and Emily says to me, "How are you today?" And I said, "Harried. Harried is how I am today." That's the answer to that question. So I don't know. Hopefully that's helpful. But it is important because really hearing that language, spirit animal, is painful to people. It is painful sometimes. And I don't want to be the source of someone's pain simply because I'm careless. This is why this matters.
Thank you. That's actually very helpful.
And yeah, and Kim, also, you don't want to hurt people by calling them out. I mean, obviously there's a bigger hurt that you need to consider, but the way that you said it was very just kind of informative, and it wasn't,
Yeah.
attacking. And I think that's important.
Well, I think it's important unless you are the person being aggrieved in that moment, right? If someone is for instance, for instance, uh let's say someone is saying something disparaging about your race in front of your children. I got no problem with that person making every possible belittling comment toward the speaker in order to halt that behavior, right? That is a call out that is appropriately placed because the harm is greater than those words calling out are going to be, right? The harm that needs to be halted is greater. Um, I am a fan of civility. I am a fan of trying to make, provide meaningful education where possible. But I think that we absolutely. I want to never hear again that a Black woman is angry in public, because you know what? That is appropriate in the culture that we live in right now, right? So I think that, like, who gets to be angry, who gets to be snarky, who gets to call somebody out, that's going to vary depending on the level of harm being caused. But yeah, most of the time, if I'm operating from my white privilege, I'm calling in, because that's not my injury to try to that's not my injury to avenge. Right? I'm calling in if it's racism. If it's, I'm trying to pick another one of my marginalized identities. If somebody's talking smack about fat people or queer people, I'm going to choose whether or not I say something snarky or calling in that moment. Chances are I'm still calling in because those are skills I have. And they're skills that I want us all to build. But no, a careful call out, that can do a world of good sometimes. So I'm going to ask you my question, which is, do you think you might have conversations about teacher pay or cultural appropriation in the coming weeks and months? If so, how might that happen?
Well, I don't think I will revisit the kingfisher spirit animal totem thing with my friend, but that was very helpful. Yeah. I'm currently dealing with another thing. I used to work up until last spring. I worked at Burning Man, and then I got laid off due to pandemic. And so I'm having like all these conversations about whether there's going to be an event this year or not. And like I was so adamant about this idea that were we to hold an event, it would require like a bunch of white people to pass through the land of the Paiute tribe of the Pyramid Lakes band of Paiute Indians in Nevada. And I was like, that's white privilege. Like, we can't just bring the virus through their lands so that we can go party. And actually, the more I'm talking about it, the more I'm kind of realizing that like my critique lacks an idea that the tribal people have their own ideas. Do you know what I mean?
Correct. So that is
Like
the
I
kind
was
of
being
thing. If they,
paternalistic. So how do I balance paternalism and cultural humility and all of it?
so first of all, the situation that you're bringing up is an excellent example of something feels wrong and you say something. That is the first step actually in anything. Like that is appropriate what you did to say, hey, there's a pandemic on and aren't we traipsing through somebody else's area and they might not want that. Um, but you are right, I think, in your second assessment, which is especially if that group of people benefits economically in any way from the existence of that festival, then it does seem like probably the question should be raised to them. Hey, we're considering this, and what are the thoughts you're having about how this would need to look in order to be safe for folks, or that we don't do it at all, um, because you're right, it is easy uh, to become a rescuer or a savior, paternalistic. All of those words are appropriate. So, folks, it is okay when I ask you these questions that you don't have an answer about where you're going to have this conversation next, but it is something that I want to ask every time so that we can continue to think about when does this stuff come up, right? And because sometimes topics come up and we are so used to ignoring them, we don't even think to engage in a deeper way. And sometimes, you get a little more info about something, it is possible to engage differently. So
I'm
that's what I have.
probably, oh,
Yes, please.
I was trying to let other people speak, but I will probably, it'll probably come up this weekend with my friends. I think we're going to be getting together for social distancing. And I think I think because I've been reading and coming to things like this, it's just always on my mind. And so when I see an opportunity, which I probably will with a bunch of, white people, to kind of lead the conversation that way, I do. And a lot of times I end up, they ask me a question, we go here, and then we go someplace and I go, wow, I don't know. Like, you have a point, that you're avoiding that guy on the street who's Black and you don't want to be hassled, and like, what do you do? And I'm like, yeah, I know that's racist and wrong, but I don't quite know how to answer you about why. So then I'll, bring it in somewhere and ask someone who's smarter than I am about these things.
This is the work that we need to do, is to have enough discussion eventually with a broad enough variety of people, because part of what's happening in these moments when well, yeah, that seems it makes sense, but then there's not actually a diversity of people at the table who might want to talk about it. It makes sense that you might have to go read something else later or consult somebody else later. That's all good. And I have had this example that you give actually come up a number of times, with regard to in trainings where people feel like, well, in order to be non-racist, I have to fully be open to every Black person I see. Well, no. No. The fact is that we have multiple vectors of discernment about harm, right? And if someone is, and yes, we absolutely want to acknowledge that Black bodies in the United States have been coded as dangerous. And I absolutely want to use every bit of discernment I have to disrupt that if those feelings come up in me. And at the same time, you know what? There is also good data about a group of boys together drinking beer at 10 o'clock at night, that if I feel like crossing the street to avoid those boys, doesn't matter to me what race they are, I'm gonna use what I know about that particular danger to my particular body. Are you following me here? So we still want all of our discernment intact, but that also means acknowledging that there are pre-patterned biases that absolutely need to be disrupted. Thank you so much for the good conversation. Is there anything else right now? Please do feel free to ask questions, send topics that you would like handled. And yes, Beth.
Have you decided what you're going to talk about next month, or is it based on your what you get, suggestions you get?
So look, I've got a list of probably 20 topics that I've not addressed yet. So far, my habit has been to decide about a week ahead of time, and I'm doing that in part in order to be responsive to what might happen in the world around us if something comes up. I also am doing that, and this might be my fantasy. Here it is, my fantasy. My fantasy is that we want to talk about social inequality regardless of what the topic is. And so I would love for people to be engaged with discussing social inequality rather than only tuning in when it's their pet topic. But I know that's my fantasy. I do.
Okay, thank you.
Peggy, did you have a hand up?
I didn't, but I'll say something. As a teacher, I'll tell you, a teacher in California, in a wealthy area, there's no way I would have been able to that I could buy anything around here. And when I retired, I had so much more money. Not having the salary, I still had more money because I was spending so much money in that classroom. We got no money for books, and I was special ed, so I really got no money. And it's crazy. It's just crazy how teachers all over the country are treated.
Yeah. It makes me makes me fiery to hear people talk about, but look at the average teacher salary in America. And I'm like, I don't think you are understanding what averages mean in this situation. Mm-hmm. That some of those higher end kind of jobs are in cities where you still can't live indoors on that wage. Like you can't compare what a teacher is making in San Francisco with what a teacher might be making in some other part of the state. And then when you add in the poverty of the district itself, that is a whole different ballgame. Yeah. Nancy, did you have something to add?
I just, I wanted to thank you for clarifying about call in and call out. I've never understood it that clearly before. Good. So I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you, beautiful people. You can look up these episodes online on YouTube if you missed something and you want to see something you didn't see in the past. They're there now. Not all of them, because not all of the video quality comes out really good, but many of them are there. Thank you, Emily. See y'all later.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Kimberly. Thank you, Emily.